LEGO Pirates of the Caribbean is a game based on a toy based on a movie based on a theme park ride, and that's very funny. Also, Gore Verbinski is quite good as a director, which doesn't hurt. LEGO Pirates adapts what was, at the time of its release, all four movies: Curse of the Black Pearl, Dead Man's Chest, At World's End, and On Stranger Tides. The first movie came out in 2003 and was rightfully a big hit, a fun, light-hearted, action-y, light horror-y, action-adventure movie with a fun concept, gorgeous locations, and action set-pieces that are well balanced around the movie's goofy, light tone. Pretty much perfect LEGO fodder. Sadly, I would consider LEGO Pirates of the Caribbean the first of the forgotten LEGO Traveler's Tales games. The Star Wars and Indiana Jones and Batman ones were pretty big hits, and while the games still sell fairly well from this point, Pirates of the Caribbean isn't nearly the brand those former few are, and this game has largely slipped through the cracks. As these games do, LEGO Pirates was on basically everything that was around in 2011, PS3, Xbox 360, backwards compatible on newer Xboxes, Wii and PC, with tiny versions for the PSP and 3DS of course. The most interesting thing LEGO Pirates does is reject modernity and return to LEGO Star Wars. The hub is more or less a formality here. Levels are selected from a series of menus in the starting area of the hub and serve as a majority of the game, with the longest and most complex levels yet alongside LEGO Star Wars 3, although not quite matching that game. The hub only consists of 3 major areas, and the only things to find are characters wandering around for purchase and red hats for extras. The pier is the level select and a beach, the watchtower lets you putz around in the mini-kit boats in a tiny body of water if you please, and the fort connects to Tiadalma's hut and the tavern. Even in LEGO Star Wars 3 there was enough rooms to limit red bricks to 1 per area, an area to buy mini-kit characters in the Bounty Hunter mission room. LEGO Pirates mostly says forget all that and goes for broke on going all out on the levels. There's a surprising lack of vehicle missions. I would have expected some kind of ship combat and would have rather liked to see it, but largely the game just does its best to make levels out of the giant set pieces and action scenes that these movies are built around, sans the pirate ship fighting ones. Characters are largely pretty samey this time around. Most are swords dudes and a handful are dudes with guns, and the rest have some other kind of melee weapon, with a good chunk of the gameplay being the same between most characters outside of a handful of traits, which is a bit less interesting than usual, but usually the level's designs make up for it. Expectedly, Jack Sparrow has the most to do. His compass is a neat idea done poorly, with each stage in the game featuring 8 items buried within them, which the compass can lead Jack to. However, it's generally a bit mindless and the low walking speed adds to the tedium. And since getting all 8 rewards a gold brick, it's going to be used a lot for 100%. Additionally, he can ride certain ropes to higher spots, which at least creates some asynchronous play, although typically it just involves leaving everyone else behind. As for everyone else, Undead and the Dutchman crew can walk along the bottom of the ocean, while all the other characters swim on top, which is a fun gimmick that adds a bit of visual variety if nothing else, while the Dutchman crew themselves can teleport through moss portals. Hammers can be used for foraging, basically a moderately recontextualized repair from the LEGO indie games. Shovels dig, bombs and blunderbusses break silver, and these can be picked up in the wild. Small guys go through small guy doors as always, strong guys can move objects with orange handles. Women high jump, singers and mermaids can sing to shatter glass, and it's all pretty standard stuff we've seen before in this series, sometimes with little twists and combining a few of these traits at once. The only other character who's actually unique is Blackbeard, who can shoot red lasers out of his sword. When I wrote this, I hadn't seen On Stranger Tides in a long time and didn't remember why he was able to do this. But yeah, there are some items only Blackbeard can destroy with his sword lasers. Although given he's unlocked by beating the 4th movie, he'll probably be largely off limits for most players for a while. Despite not being the most innovative LEGO game, probably being the most by the numbers one so far, and focusing a bit too much on combat with very little platforming, which has kind of been phased out more and more in favor of the exploration stuff, it's still solid levels, are long, varied in design, and objective. The set pieces are strong, hardly a shock given that this is a set piece movie franchise, and it gets creative mileage out of the few bosses and gimmicks it does have. Plus honestly, it being brisk isn't the worst thing in the world. While I generally like the overworld exploration stuff, it's nice to have a more compact game that's closer to LEGO Star Wars 1 and 2 than the others, a refreshingly fast-paced game for the most part. LEGO Pirates doesn't make any big leaps and bounds visually. While they clearly had a better grasp on lighting and bloom, it's still a bit below what we got from LEGO Star Wars 3. Despite that, it's still pretty high quality in the animation front, just not a marked improvement, and it has a lot of nice settings as well, which does help carry it. Even though the game primarily takes place either on beaches or on boats, it does its best to provide mix-ups to keep these relatively fresh, whether that's going below deck or having some scenes with boats in rough weather or a typhoon, island caves, or small colonial villages at the edge of the ocean. However, these settings do eventually start to wear out their welcome. Not that it's the game's fault, it's largely just a consequence of the setting. Set pieces and cinematography are generally well pulled off too, which was really the thing to nail. Cutscenes match the signature style of the LEGO series, but definitely got a bit more ambitious. Moments like the camera rotating with the giant wheel, well copied from the movies, are far less static than these goofy little vignettes usually get to be. Speaking of the wheel, it's one of many nice little moments, same with moments like the Kraken fight, the giant typhoon, and the odd melancholy of that weird sandpit Jack gets trapped in with his clones and the hordes of crabs. While this game doesn't get as many times to be fancy due to its fairly historical setting, with like 20% fantasy give or take, it makes good use of every opportunity it can to make things a little more interesting. As the LEGO games do, this movie borrows from the score of the movies it's based on. As much as I like the main theme for the series, as it's very good, it plays on every level at least once, typically many times, and it does get a little old as you go on. However, the soundtrack beyond that is all perfectly good enough. It's not memorable, it's not distracting, it's not overwhelming. It's nice movie soundtrack stuff, but you will get very tired of the main theme. While a good bit of Curse of the Black Pearl's opening is skimmed, I think the first level is a really clever intro and tutorial. Having Jack as a boss from the start against Will establishes their dynamic pretty well, despite the lack of words, and helps, to some extent, get across what the characters are like, while the latter bits of the level introduce mechanics like water walking using barrels, the compass, and a handful of other mechanics in rapid fire, as a good handful of levels use these and similar mechanics. The second Tortuga also has nice pacing to it, slowly unlocking characters in a small hub-like level with branching paths, which serves to introduce a variety of powers and how they're used, although this level would be much cooler had it played with non-linearity in some way instead of just appearing like it should. The first boat level is a good show too. Like I said, I expected some kind of ship combat, but as a first showing for how the ship levels play out, it's fun enough, and using the cannons to blow apart enemy ships is a neat little pace breaker, although it's far from the game's strongest level. The Smuggler's Den is neat for its shifted focus entirely away from combat, which has a heavy presence everywhere else, with small bits of platforming puzzles and exploring the island to build a fire while Jack and Elizabeth are stuck on the island. It's one of the few levels in this game where things slow down, so even if it's a pain to return to later for collectibles, I do appreciate it for trying to be a little different. The finale is real good too. Barbossa's skeleton pirate crew, as well as Barbossa himself, can only be damaged while the moon is shining on them, forcing at least some thought to maneuver them into place while fighting them, which makes the experience way more satisfying than another standard boss would have been. Curse of the Black Pearl is probably my favorite section of the game. It's got a nice laid-back pace that isn't too set-piece centered or combat-focused, as you could accuse some bits of the game of being, but still has those big moments that tie it all together, especially in the end, and it's based on the movie I actually really love from this franchise. Dead Man's Chest starts out on an extremely unique and interesting gimmick level. Due to a series of mishaps, Jack and the others end up trapped in round cages, and due to this are extremely limited in their actions, control a little more loosely, and struggle with hills. It's certainly no Super Monkey Ball. I wish it was. I wish they played with momentum and speed a lot more. But it's a fun gimmick that adds a bit of unique platforming to the mix without completely shifting how the game typically plays. It may well be the best level in the game, and if not, it's certainly the most unique. The swamp level, while not as interesting, features a unique theming and a few cool ideas too. Much of it forces the player to drag a large cage around, needing to find ways to cross bodies of water while carrying it, which itself serves as a bit of a platforming mix-up. The level on the Flying Dutchman, the ship of the octopus man Davy Jones, is kinda lame. The rainy night on the boat is a nice setting, but the reunion of Will and his fishman father largely consists of wandering around the deck of the ship. Funny story though, we made this way harder on ourselves by not realizing there were 2 switches on the floor to Davy Jones's cabin, and instead did some Kaizo platforming while dragging around a box, which made it hilarious and memorable for me. Dead Man's Chest is kinda weird in that it's basically a stealth 2-parter, directly leading into the next movie. As such, the game needs to contrive to some extent the Kraken into a boss fight. It's a good set piece, but maybe we're just stupid, but this boss kinda doesn't work. Throwing bombs and whatever into its mouth is a neat idea, but half the time they don't seem to count, and the other half you get sucked in with your bomb and lose all your money. I think we died more on this boss than the last 3 LEGO games combined, which sours the ending of an otherwise good set of levels with some good variety and solid set pieces beyond the kinda janky ending. As for At World's End, it's the back half of the stealth two-parter, which you'd think means it cuts straight to the action and has a lot to work with, although it's actually a bit slower paced. Singapore is a sprawling mess that's a bit of a headache to get around, but keeps the pace up with constant little set pieces, whether they be searching a wide area for objects or characters, or fighting towards the ship. Davy Jones' locker is very unique, set in the desert ocean, a vast empty space that's very unique from anything else, and pulls back the action for a unique little puzzle where Jack needs to use his compass to find different imagined versions of himself that have whatever item is needed to progress, which is a fun concept for a slower level. The following ship level is a bit generic and forgettable and leads into a level I'm completely mixed on. The Brethren Court is a gigantic vertical maze of branching paths that each end in their own little challenge to rescue one of the 6 members. It's a pain to navigate, disorienting, and slow, but even so, I think it's more interesting than it is frustrating. Really ambitious and unique for a game that largely has fairly standard levels. You'd hope the finale for At World's End would be a real banger with the whole fighting an evil ghost fishman in a maelstrom thing, but it starts with some tedious item fetching to turn Tia Dalma into crabs, and the final battle with Davy Jones doesn't take advantage of anything interesting. The setting is cool, and chasing him around to fight him on the ship's sails and mast is kinda neat, but I'm imagining some kinda interesting fight where Davy Jones' heart needs to be attacked while fighting him off, kinda like Tubba Blubba in Paper Mario or something. Ultimately, the original trilogy's finale has some really unique ideas and set pieces, but doesn't really have a lot of interesting things going on in many of them. Finally, several years later came on Stranger Tides, a really lame movie, but perhaps the LEGO version can salvage it, eh? The opening in London is a good start. Not only does the city give a nice relief from the expected settings in the game, beaches and boats, but it also has lots of stuff this game typically lacks, namely platforming between the rooftops and jumping between cars and carts mid-chase. There's actually some pretty exciting little bits of it to break up the very combat and exploration focused game otherwise. Of course, all good things must come to an end, being followed up by rather average and plain boat segments. Whitecap Bay returns to being fairly unique though. The bay is uniquely rocky for this game, and the main gimmick is carrying crates on narrow paths to move them around, which is at least a little different, and the mermaid enemies can also move through the water, giving them a little something different if not as drastically as the skeleton pirates. The jungle level has a bit of visual variety, but it's about as standard as it gets, and as for the Fountain of Youth, it's pretty okay as a finale. Charging up the weird magic lanterns in the cave is pretty interesting, as is the water that clings to the ceiling instead of the ground. Even the final boss is pretty okay, if a bit tedious, as Blackbeard mostly spends time throwing crap at the player to jump around, while they wait to beat him down every, 45 seconds, a minute, and after beating him down, feeding him the poisoned water from the fountain. The times between him becoming vulnerable are a little long and tedious, but at least it has some mechanics. At World's End has a few places it works, namely the beginning and the end, but true to its movie, a good opening set piece and a big finale can't save a mediocre middle of fluff. As for bonus content, there ain't much. You got the 20 extras found in the small overworld, 10 minikits per level, and eventually a single bonus, which like the rest of the game is one of the shortest in the series. The Ride is an adaptation of Pirates of the Caribbean, The Ride, making it an odd sort of inception in a game based on a toy based on a movie based on a ride. While the music idea and tiny little sets are cute, it's essentially 3 mini battle arenas, one for Curse of the Black Pearl, one for Dead Man's Chest and At World's End, and one for On Stranger Tides, focusing on briefly rematching all the prior bosses, but with their mechanics missing, so you basically just beat down on these pretty static big enemies. The theming holds it together as an enjoyable one-off, but it's more of a novelty than a real level or anything interesting to play through. Speaking on the movies quickly, Curse of the Black Pearl is a pretty great action-adventure movie. I think Jerry Bruckheimer managed to pretty perfectly press all the buttons that make classics like Indiana Jones work. Lighthearted and fun, funny at times even, without distracting himself from being tense, and even dipping a bit into horror, especially in this first entry. Pretty much everyone in the cast works too. Orlando Bloom and discount Natalie Portman serve as nice relatable audience surrogates to balance out everything else, even if they are a bit boring, and the movie has enough sense to treat Jack Sparrow, Johnny Depp, as a side character. He's a lot of fun, from his amazing entrance on his sinking ship to his constant back and forth betrayals, even if he proves himself to have a good heart deep down, like a drunken Han Solo. Later movies definitely shift him too hard to the forefront, and it heavily hurts the balance that the ensemble strikes. He's way too weird and zany to work as the primary protagonist. Barbossa is also a great villain, a true and honest, selfish pirate, but a man who sees himself as honorable and whose goals are pretty simple. For once, he doesn't care about fortune or greed, he just wants to free himself of his curse so he can get back to his greed, and just so happens to have an old grudge against Jack that causes most of the movie's strife. The characters really make the movie work, but there's a lot to love in other aspects too. The horror elements are a great twist on the typical action-adventure stuff, and you have lots of fun set pieces, whether that's the general spectacle of naval warfare or battles against skeleton pirates, especially in the climax. All this is to say, Curse of the Black Pearl is an extremely fun movie. It balances a lot of things, but does so pretty much flawlessly, and it's real hard not to enjoy. Light, fast-paced, funny, it's a real good time. I had a creeping fear that as Pirates went on, it would quickly lose what made Black Pearl so fantastic, and it does eventually, but it's certainly not the second and third movies, which were shot back to back. Although unlike Harry Potter, while the movies share an overarching plot, they do feel much more complete and satisfying as their own things. Dead Man's Chest has two concurrent plot lines going on. Will and Elizabeth are forced by Lord Beckett, part of the East India Trading Company's fleet, to track down Jack, as his compass is the key to finding the dead man's chest, which Beckett believes holds the key to controlling the sea, while Jack himself is pursued by Davy Jones, sort of a pirate Grim Reaper squid man, who captains a ship meant to take dead sailors to the afterlife, who himself is attempting to take Jack as a slave following returning him the Black Pearl before the series started. Although both stories quickly converge. The dead man's chest contains Davy Jones' still beating heart, which contains his mortality, and the original trio is quickly reunited. Jack's role is definitely expanded, but he's set up in a way to make him contrast with the more serious world around him, whether that be the other protagonists, the straight-laced East India guys, or the ferocious Davy Jones. The movie has a real solid visual style. It does suffer a little bit from the gray and green color grading, but it has a lot of visual effects that still hold up. Davy Jones and his Fishman crew are largely CGI, but are stylized just enough that they don't trigger an immediate disgust response, nor does Jones's pet, the Kraken, which is cleverly shown almost solely in small glimpses. Davy Jones isn't as fun as Barbossa. He's not a dickhead pirate who's equally as selfish as Jack, but more cruel, but is instead more interesting for being a sort of force of nature. His Kraken destroys everything, he pursues Jack endlessly, and he seems to have no weaknesses. Despite largely setting up for the third movie, there's a lot of great set pieces and moments too. The Cannibal Island at the start is a little more lighthearted, which kind of segues into the more serious stuff that happens later, and pretty much every scene with the Kraken is super intense, and the ending where Jack just straight up dies is great as well. And of course there's the Liar's Dice scene. It's a simple dice game where Will attempts to gain information on the dead man's chest by gambling his freedom against Jones. It's really intense and probably the best scene in the movie, and it doesn't have any fighting or action in it at all. The movie does have some bits of Part 1 syndrome. Jack's death is obviously not permanent, and it's a big cliffhanger to end on, and largely nobody has an arc, but you do get some amount of satisfying resolution. Jones being alive at the end doesn't change that the power dynamic is completely shifted by Beckett having his heart, and therefore power over him, his ship, and the Kraken, which definitely shifts the dynamic of the sequel and makes it very much its own thing. Dead Man's Chest does struggle in places. It's really long for something that doesn't have a lot of payoff, but it's carried on some really big and memorable moments. It's probably the weakest of the three, but a lot of what it does is to fuel the sequel, so it's forgivable in context, and it's still pretty fun on its own. At World's End starts rather boldly, with a lot of change. I kinda love it. In the time between this and the prior movie, the East India Trading Company has taken over the sea and is executing anyone and everyone associated with piracy. Davy Jones has become a slave to their whims, a sort of capo who brings other pirates in for them. The Kraken is dead. I do feel this is partially a budgetary concern, but it's a bold way to establish a new threat. Jack remains dead, Barbossa is undead, and everyone is in China attempting to find a way to get Jack back. The movie is ambitious, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. There's great moments, usually the quiet ones. Sailing to the titular world ends is very pretty and serene. Flipping the boat to escape Davy Jones' locker is a very fun and unique set piece with some fun visuals. And Jack and his hallucinatory doubles in the locker attempting to escape it is a nice little comedy bit. But as with the prior movie, it's a little long in the tooth and perhaps balances it a little less well. There's constant minor action, it still plays with comedy, and Jack is used well as a comedic foil to the war going on around him, but it does kind of drag as it goes on. The climactic final battle with Davy Jones in a giant typhoon kind of goes on forever, and while there are fun bits, it gets exhausting in the same way Revenge of the Sith finale does, even if this movie is substantially more well constructed than that. I do like the movie and its prequel that sets it up. I think this one pays off everyone's stories and arcs really well. It's exciting, well made, and has some impressive effects work for the time. But both this and its prequel could be considered fairly meandering. Both could have used a solid trim to keep them a little tighter, which would have helped them come together better, I think. I don't have much to say about On Stranger Tides. It's the most okay movie I've seen in a long time. Directed by future Disney paid gun Rob Marshall of The Little Mermaid live action and Mary Poppins Returns fame, this movie is safe, uninspired, and a little awkward. Will Turner and Elizabeth are out, replaced by not much. Jack is now officially the main character, and without proper, normal characters to play off of, he wears on your patience real fast. Following a tease at the end of the prior movie, Jack is on the hunt for the Fountain of Youth and ends up reconnecting with a woman he used to love, Angelica. She's boring. He also works with her father in this endeavor, the most famous pirate of all time, Blackbeard. He's cartoonishly evil, his sword shoots voodoo lasers, he kills his own crew for no reason, tries to do the same to his daughter. He's not fun evil like Barbossa, he's a puppy-kicking Power Rangers villain that doesn't typically play off of Jack very well. The story's attempts at a relatable character for the audience are a singing Christian and the mermaid he's fallen in love with. Neither has any personality or presence, and could be completely cut from the script with very little impact on the movie. The movie also doesn't make up for the cast with great action. There's a fun opening scene in London, but once they hit the jungle, there's a lot of nothing until a very mediocre final battle. There's nothing aggressively wrong with it, it's a bit boring, a bit safe. Jack should never be the main character, but more than anything, it's just uninspired. It isn't fun and doesn't seem like it really cares to be. It seems like a Disney product meant to appeal to as many people as possible after the original run of the franchise ran its course to revive it. It's aggressively mediocre. LEGO Pirates of the Caribbean is refreshingly stripped back, roughly on par with LEGO Star Wars 2 as far as content goes. 3 movies of levels, a simple bonus, the standard collectibles, and a bit in the overworld defined. It's short and sweet, simple, and focused on translating the series' fantastic set pieces into tight action levels. It's very back to basics, and it works well in following up the mildly bloated and very exploratory Harry Potter games, although LEGO Star Wars 3 went similarly stripped back, although to a slightly lesser extent, and feels much more polished. There are a few notable missteps here. The compass would be overkill even if it wasn't so tedious and slow. It probably would have helped the pace massively to not turn it into a required element for collectibles. Not only that, but the game kinda lacks polish in a few areas, not to the extent of being super buggy like the Harry Potter games were, but there are definitely a few areas where it feels notably cheaper than LEGO Star Wars 3, and also, the 3rd and 4th movies definitely are not as strong as the first 2 as far as gameplay goes. Beyond that though, it's probably the simplest these games have been in a while, trimming the fat down to basically nothing and making a charming game focused on exciting gameplay moments. It's a bit middling, certainly nowhere near the top of the LEGO pile, but it's a fun enough little game in the end.